So this week is Parshas Korach, and in this week's Parsha we learn about Trumas Maises and Trumas Maiso, Mitzvahs Hatluyas Ba'oretz. And the discussion we will have today is a sugya I think I never really discussed at length and in depth in public, but it's a fascinating sugya. It is one of those sugyas that one cannot really reach clear conclusions and decisions halacha l'maisa, because there are so many sources and many of them seem to be contradictory, but still it's a fascinating sugya. Terumah bizman hazeh, Shvi'is bizman hazeh, Derabanan, Perek Aleph, I think it's halacha chavav, the last halacha Perek Aleph Hilchos Terumah, the Rambam clearly writes, Terumah bizman hazeh, and all the other mitzvahs hatluyas ba'oretz bizman hazeh derabanan. Do they have a din of sveika derabanan lekula, or maybe not? Are we machmer b'terumah bizman hazeh as if it would be min haTorah, or is it like any other derabanan? Many sources lakan ulachan, but let me start off with a historical overview. Two of the great Gedolim that were extremely instrumental and active in laying the groundwork and the framework, B'Yishuv HaChodosh, 70, 80, 90 years ago, when waves of immigration came to Eretz Yisrael, and the Gedolim really needed to define and determine our approach to the various mitzvahs hatluyas ba'oretz, Reb Hesh Pesach Frank and the Chazon Ish. And in many different halachas they had different opinions and different attitudes. One of them I will share with you. So one of the big problems was Trumas Maises. If you want to be Mekayim the mitzvahs of Trumas Maises, you need to throw away 1% of the produce of the field. Why 1%? Terumah Gedolah is not important. It's not significant in the financial aspect, because Chito Achas Poteres Sakri. Meiser is 10%, but Meiser is mutar lezor, so it's not a problem. Anybody can eat Meiser. But Trumas Meiser is 1% of the produce, and it's osa lezor, osa betumah, and therefore you need to actually throw away 1%. The farmers couldn't afford throwing away 1%. So many different bodies need to make a profit on fruits and vegetables. The farmers, the distributors, the wholesalers, the retailers, the stores. 1% is a lot to throw away, and the farmers weren't willing to do so. Reb Hesh Pesach Frank comes up with a spark of genius in Har Tzvi's Rom Chelek Aleph Siman Kuf Zayin, and he says, based on the Gemara, Beitz Dalad Amid Beis, Ein Mevatel Lechatchila, Is it Rabbanon Mutar Levatel Lechatchila? Yoredei Tzadik Tezvav, the Psak is, even in his Rabbanon Osa Levatel, but many Poiskim, and the Rambam Beroishim say, Is it Rabbanon She'ein Loikim in HaTorah? Mutar Levatel Lechatchila. So Reb Hesh Pesach Frank suggested in Har Tzvi, 1% is Trumas Meiser, but Meiser, Terumah is botel b'yechad hameya. So we need to take a very small part of that 1%, 0.1%, even less, throw it away, dispose of it. And the rest is botel b'yechad hameya. V'mutar levatel lechatchila b'derabbanan she'ein loikim min haTorah. That was Reb Hesh Pesach's spark of genius. Chazon Ish totally disagrees, as we find in Chazon Ish Demai Ted Zayin Yud Zayin. He doesn't mention Reb Hesh Pesach. He never does. However, he relates to his psak, and he disagrees, and he says, Terumah bizman hazeh dinoi k'dioraisa. And here's a powerful argument. The entire source of Ein Mevatlan Issa Lachatchila is in Masechet Terumah. There is no other source in the Mishnah. Perek Hey Mishnah Tes Masechet Terumah. And the Chazon Ish wants to prove from a Gemara in Psochim. Stam Terumah Bizman HaMishnah is Terumah Bizman Hazeh, which is the Rabbanon. Because the Mishnah was compiled, the Achachor Mabayis. And if the Mishnah says, Legabe Terumah, Ein Mevatel Lechatchila proves, even Terumah Bizman Hazeh, Asur Levatel Lechatchila. And the Chazon Ish analyzes the Rambam. Perek Yud Gimel, Aloche Yud, Aloche Yud Aleph. Let me read to you these two halachas. So Terumah shenofla lepochas mamei chulin. ונופלו חולן אחרים עד שהוסיפו על 100. אם בשוגג הרי זה עולה ביחד 100, ואם במזד הרי הכל מדומה. שאין מבטלן איסר תוירו לכתחילה. אין מבטלן איסר תוירו לכתחילה. The Chazon Ish says, is the Rambam dealing with Terumah D'Oraisa or Terumah D'Rabbanan? Terumah Bizman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. The Rambam clearly says, as I quoted before, Sof Perek Aleph Terumah Bizman Hazeh D'Rabbanan. And the Rambam writes, Ein mevatlen is ator lechatchila. Haloch Yud Aleph. Terumah chutzlotz muter levatla berov. Why? Because it's only D'Rabbanan. So the Rambam clearly says, Terumah chutzlotz ein lo ikar min haTorah mutar levatel. Terumah sets us all even bizman hazeh asa levatel. That is the opinion of the Chazon Ish. And the Chazon Ish goes over this again, Likutei Zeroim Simen Yud Aleph. But it's not clear what he's relating to in that Simen in Likutei Yud Aleph. Shevet HaLevi, Harav Vosna, Chelik Beisim Reish Yutes. I never really understood why Reish Yutes is printed at the very end of the Sefer, after the Mafteches. Sefer ends Reish Yutes, after the Mafteches. And Rav Vosna says, I just want to explain the background of the Chazon Ish. Zroim Lekutim Yud Aleph. It was a letter written to me. And Rav Vosna shares what he asked the Chazon Ish and what the Chazon Ish answered. Rav Vosna had an extremely powerful argument against the Chazon Ish. Yored Deyo Kuf Chof Aleph. Yored Deyo Kuf Chof Aleph is Dinei Hag'ola Hechsher Keilim. And we learn there, Kli Cheres Yefshar Lachshiro. Eine Yoitze Medei Dofno Liyolam. So if a Kli Cheres is Balei Issa, you need to dispose of it, you need to throw it away. However, Terumah, which is the Rabbanon, Magila Gimel Pa'omim V'dayoi. That's what the Tur brings in the name of the Bala Itur. Both the Bach and the Beis Yosef explain. Terumah Bizman Hazeh, Ein lo ikar min haTorah, and therefore even a Kli Cheres you could be Magil. The Bach wants to say, Terumah Schutz Lotz, yes lo ikar min haTorah. Terumah Bizman Hazeh, Ein lo ikar min haTorah. And that is the opposite of what the Chazon Ish wants to prove from the Rambam that I explained just a moment ago. The Chazon Ish responds by saying, Ein ledamois divrei chachomim ze lo ze. And even though we are mekel by Terumah Bizman Hazeh lagabe hagolas Kli Cheres, doesn't mean we will mekel lagabe ein mevatlen issa lechatchila. Ein ledamois. And this brings us to the discussion of Shvi'is. So when the Chazon Ish argues or disputes Repesh Pesach Frank, it's not about Sofek. Do we say Shvi'is D'Rabbanan L'Kula, or is it Shvi'is D'Oraisa L'Chomra? No. It's about Ein Mevatlen. But the Chazon Ish in two different sources, Shvi'is Chov Beis Aleph, Maseres Zayin Tezvav. Chazon Ish deals with Shvi'is and he says, Terumah Bizman Hazeh L'Chumra, Shvi'is L'Chumra V'lo L'Kula. And the same Shvi'is Bizman Hazeh. Shvi'is Chov Beis, he deals, he has a machlokes with the Beis HaShulchan. The Yerushalmi Bereish Orla has a suffix Ilan B'Torch HaBayis. Yes, B'Shvi'is or in B'Shvi'is. Pesach Shulchan says Shvi'is V'Zman HaDarabbanan, and therefore Sveika L'Kula. Chazon Ish says Ika Min HaTorah Sveika L'Chumra. Masr Simen Zayin is a very famous Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish feels everybody should be mafresh tumas hamaises b'beisoi. Torcha de Advom, he says, why aren't we makel? Sofik tumas hamaises sveika de Rabbanon. Yesh lo wikim an ha-Torah v'sveika l'chumra. Where do we find in Shas B'chlal that there's a difference between a Rabbanon sheyesh lo wikim an ha-Torah and a Rabbanon she'ein lo wikim an ha-Torah? Chazon Ish writes in his letter to Rav Osna, it's only once in Shas Gittin Samachai. I think it's twice, also on Brochas Nun Beis and the Beis. Brochas Nun Beis, the Gemara deals with Dina Netilas Yadayim, Mutav L'Tamois Tumas Yadayim, the Rabbanon she'ein lo wikim an ha-Torah, v'loi Tumas Oichlon sheyesh lo wikim an ha-Torah. Gittin Samachai, the Gemara says Kotan ein lo kinyan. However, Lagabe Ruva Chetzeis and Shetufa Mavois, we could do it Deiktana because the Rabbanon. The Gemara asks, call the Tikkun Rabbanon Ken Dioraisa Tikkun. And the Gemara answers, Hana Mila Beyesh Lo Yikim An HaTorah. Ein Lo Yikim An HaTorah, we don't say Ken Dioraisa Tikkun. And at the Hemshech of that very same sugya, Terumah Bizman Hazeh, where Mekel Ein Lo Yikim An HaTorah, Lo Kedivre Chazon Ish. Chazon Ish says once again, Ein Ledamos. Hazeh Ish also tries to explain that the very concept of Yesh Lo Ikim and HaTorah and Ein Lo HaTorah is not concrete. It's very fluid. Because it's not a major sugya in Shas. And that's an important comment as we move forward. So I brought two Gemaras that were more mekel, but Ein Lo Yikim an HaTorah than Yesh Lo Yikim an HaTorah. And now I want to share with you three Taisus that were machmir betrumah bizman hazeh, as if it would be Dioraisa. Number one is Lagabe Eim Avat Lenisel Achatchila, Beitza Dav Dalad Omed Beis Taisus, Erevin Lamed Beis Omed Aleph. The Gemara deals with the sugya Chazuk HaShliach Oiseh Shlichuto. And the Gemara says, by the Uraisa, we're not Soymech, and this Chazukah by the Rabbanon, we are. Toysa says, Terumah Bizman Hazeh, like the Uraisa, we're not Soymech. Erev and Lamed Zayin Amid Beis, the Gabi the Machloikes Yesh Breira, Ein Breira. And the Gemara says, by the Uraisa, Ein Breira, by the Rabbanon, Yesh Breira. And Toysa once again says, Terumah Bizman Hazeh, has a din the Uraisa, Ein Breira. Does that have to do with Suffolk? Maybe it does. So why do we say b'diuraisa ein breira b'deraboni yesh breira? There are two different approaches. Shagas Arya Simen Tzadik, Tshuvas Bekiveg Achadosh Sorachayim Simen Hey, brings the Shagas Arya, and he says he's right. And there's a rai from the Ran and Gittin. Chofei Medape Mesechta, Yud Beizom et Beiz Medape Arif. It's Mashmein Ran. The reason diuraisa ein breira is because Veke diuraisa lechumra. That's the same reason why the Rabbanon Yesh Breira is fake the Rabbanon Lakula. However, the Yam Sheshloim the Mashal Bavakam Perakei Simin Yud Beis clearly says has nothing to do with Suffolk. B'diuraisa ein breira bein lakula bein lachumra b'derabbanon yesh breira bein lakula bein lachumra. So it can be mishum sveika derabbanon lakula. So according to the Ran Rabbi Kiveg and Shagasadi, we have proof that Terumah Bizman Hazeh sveika lachumra. But according to the Yam Sheshloim and the Chazon Ish, has the same opinion as the Yam Sheshloim, Demai, Tet, Chof Aleph, we have no proof from this sugya. The fundamental question, Terumah Bizman Hazeh, Sveika L'Kula or L'Chumra, is a huge discussion hundreds of years before the Peish Pesach Frank and the Chazon Ish. Goes way back. Mishnah Melech Terumah Zayin Yud Zayin has an arichus mefleges, a very lengthy discussion, and he says exactly what the Chazon Ish says. Terumah Bizman Hazeh Sveika L'Chumra, Yesh Lo Yikim an HaTorah. However, he seems somewhat to contradict himself on Pchoides Daled Aleph, and in Megillah Aleph, Yud Aleph, Beis Yosef quotes the Mabit. This is an interesting question. It's Hilchas Megillah. Ayorasam Sepukos, did they have a Choyma be a Mesh Yeshua Ben Nun or not? Read 2 days. Yudara and Tesvav without a bracha. And the question is, why wouldn't we say Sveikat Darabonon Akola? So he's potter both days, because Megillah Darabonon. So the Mishnah Melech quotes the Mabit. The Mabit says, every Jew in every community needs to read the Megillah someday, either Yudalet or Tesvav. So you can't patter both days because Sveikat Darabonon Akola, because it's Treikura de Satri Ahadoda. We find a similar question in the Ran Sechet Psochim, Perek Arve Psochim. When the Gemara says there's a machloikis, which of the 2 cases do we need Haseba? 1 and 2 or 3 and 4? So the Gemara says because we don't know, and that's why we do Haseba both. And the Ran says, if we have a suffix, Sveikat Darabonon Akola, and the Ran is the first one to answer and to explain. Everybody agrees that we need a seva by 2 cases. And we can't say Sveikat Darabonon Akola if the result will be that we won't have a seva neither 1, 2 or 3, 4. That's a Tarata de Satra. Same idea as we find by Megillah. But the Mishnah Melech quotes the Mabit. If not for this photo, we would say Sveikat Darabonon Akola. We don't say Shvi'is b'zman hazeh yesh lo yikim min haTorah, and it is as if min haTorah. Shuvas Masham Chelek Aleph Ayin Beis. Sham deals with the question of Halacha L'Maaseh. A big mishloach of esrogim arrived from Eretz Yisrael. Every box had a kasher certificate, Hufresh Terumah Ma'aser Kedin, except 1 box. And the Masham says it's a suffix. Maybe the Mishgiach didn't realize, and he did not take off Terumah Ma'aser, or maybe just the certificate got lost somewhere along the way. The Masham wants to be maker because Terumah B'zman hazeh Darabonon, but then he says the Mishnah Melech is machmir by Terumah B'zman hazeh, and therefore one should be machmir. Going back 200 years before the Mishnah Melech, Tshuvas Marashdam, Yoredei Kuf Tzadik Beis, Sveikat Darabonon Akola beTerumah B'zman hazeh. Shulchan Aruch Shin Lamed Aleph Sif Yud Aleph Lagabe Breira, Shach Shin Lamed Sif Kot Neches Lagabe Sofek Chala, Bach Even Ezer Kuf Nun Vav. When there's a question, who is this child? Who was his father? Was he a Kohen or not a Kohen? Bach says Terumah B'zman hazeh Darabonon, so we would be Mekel. So we have Gedolei Olam, Marashdam, Beis Yosef, Bach, Shach, all say Terumah B'zman hazeh Darabonon, Sveikat Darabonon Lekula. Shin Chof Hei Sif Aleph is another halacha. There's a boy in Yerushalmi, Tavla she'ein ba lebazbez. Is there tzir of kli or there is no tzir of kli? We find a similar suga in the Bavli. Shach says Sif Koten Beis, Chala B'zman hazeh Darabonon, Sveikat Darabonon Lekula. Shach Lishitosa. So as we see, there are many sources, and it is virtually impossible to give a psak. The very concept of yesh lo ikem min haTorah, ein lo ikem min haTorah is very fluid. There are so many different nuances and dakus. Regarding Terumah Ma'aser, 3 different questions. Terumah B'zman hazeh, Terumah Peiros is a machloikis whether it's min haTorah or not. Terumah Yerek L'Kula Almei Darabonon, is that defined as yesh lo ikem min haTorah? Terumah Chutz La'aretz, B'zman sheBeis HaMikdash Kayim. So as I mentioned before, Beis Yosef Bach, Kuf Chof Aleph B'Yoredei, say, Terumah B'zman hazeh ein lo ikem min haTorah. Chazon Ish wants to prove, Terumah Chutz La'aretz ein lo ikem, Terumah B'zman hazeh yesh lo, but in the Bach it's mavur lehefech. There is room to argue Terumah Peiros, Terumah B'zman hazeh, Terumah Chutz La'aretz as yesh lo ikem min haTorah. Because at the very same time, you have Terumah D'Oraisa and Etzisur. You have Terumah D'Oraisa B'Dogon Tira Shvi'is. Terumah B'Zman Hazeh, there is no Terumah D'Oraisa, and therefore maybe it's easier. Maybe it's more Lohakal. Maybe it's only Iker Min HaTorah. Gzeres, Iker Min HaTorah or not. Toys of the Zorach of Daled says, Chav Beis Medalef says regarding Meleches Chalamoyed, Gzerot Shabbos Yom Tov, and therefore Iker Min HaTorah. And I don't get it. All Isur in the Rabbanon are Gzeres. There is no other reason for Chum to ask anything if not a Gzera in the context of a Susyag LeTorah. Maybe there's a difference between Chalamoid, because Chalamoid Min HaTorah is Mekroi Kodesh. There's a mitzvah D'Oraisa of Simcha. Chalamoid has Kedusha just like Shabbos Yom Tov has Kedusha, and therefore it is more reasonable to say that this Gzeira is Iker Min HaTorah, but not all of the other Gzeiras. And then there's a different concept which we call D'Oraisa Shenes Galgel L'Drabanan. And I want to give a few brief examples. And it's a D'Oraisa. It's Batal Berav. But one of those Dvorim She'ena Betelem Berav, Beria, Dovar Choshuv, Isure Hanoah. But it's only Midrabona that all these aren't Batal Berav. So it's Issa D'Oraisa Shenes Galgel L'Drabanan. Originally, it was a Sveika D'Oraisa or an Issa D'Oraisa. Lachashu Batal Berav, it becomes an Issa D'Rabanan. Klisha Bola Isser, Eine Ben Yoimai. Eine Ben Yoimai is only Issa D'Rabanan, Gzerot Ben Yoimai. Dam Shebishloi. Issa Dam Min HaTorah, Dam Shebishloi D'Rabanan. It is these cases that we define as Issa D'Oraisa Shenes Galgele D'Rabanan, and that is also a huge discussion with many sources, Lakan Ulakan. What is the din of an Issa D'Oraisa Shenes Galgele D'Rabanan? So what I tried to explain in the past few minutes is just the complexity, even in the very fundamental definitions. What is a D'Rabanan Sheyesh Lo Iker Min HaTorah? And what is the din of a D'Rabanan Sheyesh Lo Iker Min HaTorah? And we touched upon so many sugyas. Yesh breira, ein breira, hag ole biklei cheres. And above and beyond all those specific halachas, do we say Sveika D'Rabanan L'Kul? Because at the end of the day, Terumah B'Zman Hazeh D'Rabanan, or are we Machmir B'Sveikas? I think after this presentation, this Shiur, one could appreciate what I said at the beginning of the Shiur. This is not a Sufik Sheyesh B'Yudeinu L'Hachriya. So many different sources and so many contradictions. The Chazon Ish himself, 3 places he writes, Terumah B'Zman Hazeh Dinoi K'D'Oraisa. Soiser Divrei Atzmoi. In 2 different sources. Chof Aleph, Yud Zayin. The Chazon Ish deals with a suffix in Isor Avodas HaOretz V'Hu Ilonos. There are so many sveikas in these halachas. So the Chazon Ish says, we are makel because it's a suffix betray the Rabbanon. One the Rabbanon is Shvi'is B'Zman Hazeh the Rabbanon. And we're dealing with Avodas She'enam Asuros Elo Mid Rabbanon. So in this Chazon Ish we see, he's Metzaref Shvi'is B'Zman Hazeh the Rabbanon to make a trade the Rabbanon. I don't think it's an argument, and not necessarily a stira, because the base Shmuel, and this is a big chiddush, even as a Chovches Nun base, dealing with the sugya of Hamakadesh Esu Isha Bechite Kurdenaisa, Trei the Rabbanon, Chometz Noikshe, Shochamishis. Base Shmuel says Trei the Rabbanon is always defined as Ein Lo Iker Min HaTorah. We do find the concept the Rabbanon Sheyesh Lo Iker Min HaTorah, but if it's Trei the Rabbanon, it has more distance, more remote, and it is always defined as Ein Lo Iker Min HaTorah. I still think there's a stira in Chazon Ish. Shvi'is, Yud, Siman Yud, Ois Yud Gimel, regarding Demei Shvi'is. Shvi'is tefeses domeo. Chazon Ish writes we're makel because Shvi'is bizman hazeh derabanan. So we have stiras in Mishamelech. We have stiras in Chazon Ish. And so many different sources. But the sugya is a fascinating one. And I have a fundamental feeling. It's just a feeling. Some of the chumras that we find in Chazon Ish mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz, I think the Chazon Ish had a hashkafa. Kulas are for the individual, but we cannot base our presence in Eretz Yisrael and our attitude to mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz al smach b'di eved. B'di eved is for coincidence. Shas Adchak is for the individual. We need to develop and work out a system that as a community, as a people, as a nation, we could be Makayim mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz lechatchila in their purest form. Mitzvah min hamuvchar. And that is why he was not happy about the Pesach suggestion that we should be mavatal. All the Terumah Meiser in the state of Israel rely that it's a Rabban Shein Lekum Torah mutar levatal lechatchila. I think the Chazon Ish had some ruchniistic view, and he said this is not right. We waited 2,000 years to be Mekayim mitzvahs atluyas ba'aretz. We want to do them lechatchila without relying on Shas Adchak and b'di'eved. That is how I fundamentally understand the approach of the Chazon Ish. Because the Chazon Ish was aware of these dilemmas and these contradictions and the very important sources that are mekel betruma bizman hazeh, kechol issa derabanan, and some of these important sources we just quoted and dealt with. I think that every year I share with you the same idea on Parshas Korach because it's hard to speak about anything else in this parsha. Anything else but how bad, how dangerous, how detrimental Machlokes is for Beis Yisrael. So Rashi brings, when the entire Eidah was swallowed up in the belly of the earth and destroyed, Kamakusha Onsha Shemachlokes. Beis in Shamata don't punish a person till he's 20 years of age. Beis in Shalmata, 13 and up. Bavoina Machlokes afataf nispim, even children pay the price. How do we understand that? Reb Chaim Vital in the Likutei Torah quotes his great Rebbe Dari HaKodesh on the Pasuk Yepola memchen davar bein dam ledam, bein nega lenega, bein din ledin. There he brings a medrash. Shalu ansh malachi ashoras es HaKodesh Baruch Hu, the angels asked HaKodesh Baruch Hu, you gave us a Torah, and you did not perform your own mitzvahs. And these questions were asked by the Malachim in the days of Churban Abayis. Atu amarto, v'shofach es doma v'chiso ba'ofa, v'lo kiyamta domam nishpach kamayim ve'ein kover. You gave us a mitzvah, oisev es benoi, lo yisashchato b'yom echad, and you didn't be mekayim this mitzvah, because Tzidkiyahu HaMelech and his children were murdered in the same day. Atu amarto opinos abayis, and only then v'roa kohenes nega. First you take everything out of the house. And the Mishnah in the Goam explains why. Torachos al klei cheres. Klei matres, gold and silver, you could be toivel. Klei schuches, you could be toivel. But klei cheres ein lem tahara b'miklo. And therefore the Torah says, first take all the vessels out of the house to salvage them from tumas oihel. V'lo kiyamta. Bayit v'kol machmadea olim be'esh. Those are the questions Malach Ashuras asked the Kodesh Baruch Hu. The Medrash doesn't say what the Kodesh Baruch Hu answer. Maybe he didn't answer at all. He doesn't need to answer. But the Riyah Kodesh does answer. And the answer is, Divrei Rivois B'Shorech. Where there's Machlokes, there's absolutely no manifestation of Midas HaRachamim. And those mitzvahs are somewhat an expression of Rachamim. So yes, Kodesh Baruch Hu didn't perform his mitzvahs And that is because divrei rivois b'shorech. And that is why even children pay the price. Kivan shenitne reshus lemashches lahashches enoi mavchen being tov l'ra doesn't differentiate between children and adults. So how far and to what extreme do we need to go to enhance shalom b'yisrael and to steer clear from machlokes? Haneloven v'yena molvin shomach haposim v'yena meshiven aleim akos avoyim v'ohav of kitzes hashemesh b'gveros. The Shvus Yankov orphans, a beautiful pshat, and he wasn't aware that this pshat is already found in Toisus Arosh and a Meiri, Yavomis Peites and in Gittin Lamed Vav. And it's a beautiful thought. The very first din Torah in history was not between two mortals, two human beings, but rather between heavenly bodies. And the Levona comes to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and he says, Ein shnei malochem misham shemekes arechod. It's either me or he. It's either me or the son. What did the son respond? I don't think he said anything. It's not found in Chazal. My feeling is that the son says, what is he talking about? Who are the shtei malochem? Because Baruch Hu says, him and you. And the Shemesh is taken aback and he's astounded. He says, I'm a king? I never saw myself as a king. I thought I'm a servant, not a king. So the Shemesh didn't respond. The Shemesh was menan aloven ve'ena malven. Ma'osa Kodesh Baruch Hu, hiktin et yarech v'gdil et Shemesh. And that is a promise throughout the ages. Whenever one will be, menan aloven ve'ena malven, shomach haposim ve'ena meshimen, olav hakos avoyim, va'ohavav ketzes hashemesh b'gvurosai. Kodesh Baruch Hu will fight for you. You don't need to do it yourself, on your own. You should just be happy with what you have. Thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the bezyonis. They're all kaporas avoynis. Va'ohavav ketzes hashemesh b'gvurosai. So I said an interesting, and to me it is a very appealing pshat in Rashi this week's parsha. Moshe Rabbeinu tells Korach, Boiker v'yoyda Hashem es ashaloi. And Rashi says, Im atu yochal lafach boiker la'erev ve'erev la'boiker atu yochal achlak al zeh. And my suggestion would be, Kodesh Baruch Hu iktin et erech, ikdil et shemesh. So Moshe Rabbeinu tells Korach, if you could turn things upside down. Tagdil et erech v'tagdil et shemesh. And then night will become day, and day will become night. But you can't do that because the Kodesh Baruch Hu already decided 6,000 years ago. Hiktin et erech v'igdil et shemesh. And that is a promise to all those ohavav ketzes hashemesh b'gvurosai. Lo imotzu HaKadosh Baruch Hu kli machzik brocha liYisrael elo hashalom. Talmidei Chachamim b'shalom yoylam. ShaKadosh Baruch Hu yizreinu l'man kavod shemoi. We should always be one of those Talmidei Chachamim hamar b'shalom b'yoylam. And in the schis of shalom b'Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should send us mevaser tov, mevaser shalom. Eliyahu Hanavi b'Yeshua Selomim b'bias goyal tzedek b'mehero v'yomeinu amen.